15 had a seminal impact on me as far as developing my screenwriting career. I'd done a little bit prior to 15, but it really wasn't something I'd focused on intensely. And I'd certainly never been in the situation where I had the chance to be the head writer of a show. And I, mean, I shouldn't overstate it because John Binkley, the producer, was involved creatively at every step of the process. So it wasn't as though
you were the head writer
well,
and the writer.
Well, yeah, but it was great in terms of cracking the storylines each season. I mean, that began with John and I.
Well, we played together.
Yeah. We one wonderful year, John flew us down to Puerto Vallarta for 3 days, and we basically sat around the beach and sat around the lounge at the hotel for 3 days, kicking story ideas around. And out of that, I got to work on the long story.
Margaritas help.
The margaritas always help. But for me, it was. I mean, it simply was. It was like a master class in writing for television in terms of just out there, to some extent trial and error for me as a writer, because it wasn't a path I'd gone down before. But working at that rate of speed and working with that intensity, and working that closely with John, it was for me. It was first and foremost an extraordinary learning experience. But it also gave me the chance to run a story department, which is a huge thing for a writer to do, to have that kind of responsibility and control over what happens script-wise for a series. And it very much was the show that started me on spending 2 decades as a screenwriter.
In a number of shows where you've been the creator and the showrunner and the head, many executive producer and assume roles that mention. I think you ought to mention that.
Yeah, well, I've worked for a number of shows in Canada, both as a story editor and executive producer. A few years after 15, I got a chance to create a teen series of my own for CBC television, which was called Edgemont, which ran for several seasons. And fairly recently on, again, a CBC project, but I was the creator and executive producer and as well as the writer of a miniseries called Dragon Boys, which was a fictional journey into the world of Asian organized crime. On the West Coast, a very different kind of writing. But you know what? I discovered that I was using chops that I first started exploring back on 15. It very much is it's a large cast show with storylines and character arcs woven together, and doing the weave, doing the arc on a soap like 15 is absolutely the training you need for that kind of process.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what I want to ask you to do last, and we're not running out of time or anything, but it's kind of a flight of fancy to go with it where you like. But the question is, if you were creating today, if you were in that role of creating 15 for the 21st century, do you think the fact that this is a different era, 20 years later, would that change the story of Matt or Brooke or Dylan or Ashley? Would it change their storylines, their characters, or not? And if so, how might it? Just flight of fancy. I mean, just off the top of your head. We're not trying to do this on camera today.
Yeah.
But just wherever that flight of fancy might take you, or thoughts on that?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, I think I'd actually back into the answer. I mean, first of all, I think it's sometimes 20 years later, it's sometimes easy to overlook or underplay how groundbreaking 15 really was. I mean, it's not as though that it was the first teen show ever to be on North American television, but the territory had not really been mined to anything like the extent that we've seen post 15. If you think back to teen shows in that era, I mean, Degrassi, north of the border, 15 south of the border, and of course north of the border in Canada as well. And then you start thinking, well, the other shows that come to mind, the Dawson Creeks of the world, the Beverly Hills zip codes of the world, show, Saved by the Bell. Those are all shows that came later, And so in terms of much of the initial excitement for me in 15 was that great sense of being part of something that really was breaking ground. And then, of course, falling in love with the characters, and which sustains and extends the excitement over the course of a number of episodes for the creators and the people involved in that end of things, as well as one hopes the audience. But there was a tremendous freshness about 15 because of that. in that sense, I think it would be. It would. I'm not really sure if it would be possible to do a show like 15 again. Uh, the television universe and the, I think, television viewership to a certain extent has become so inundated in the last 20 years with so many different kinds of show and so many different kinds of teen show. I don't know if it would be possible to approach a show which had the kind of freshness, and I hesitated to use a word like innocence, except it does apply to 15. I mean, it was a show in which real issues were dealt with. It was a show in which real stakes were involved. It was a show, certainly in the fifth season, when the issue of pediatric cancer was addressed. So it didn't ever shy away from those large, serious issues. But it also wasn't. It wasn't a show of crack addicts, a show of teenage pregnancies. It wasn't a show in that sense where I think that as a teen show today, you almost have to go just because everyone else has covered the turf, that extends prior to that. I mean, the sheer universality of 15, I think, was something which was possible in significant part because 15 was breaking ground. It was out there on its own. I don't know if you could approach a show on that universal basis today as you could back in 19.